The moment Mark said, "We don't have room for you," Evelyn felt something inside her crack like thin ice, giving way under a heavy boot. She had spent years pouring love into the inn, clinging to the memories of her late husband, believing her son would protect what they built together. But now, as she stood alone in the hallway, she heard Mark and Lydia laughing softly behind the door, talking as if she were a burden they needed to get rid of. Why was her own son ashamed of her? What truth could destroy their family forever? Who lied first, and who will pay the price? Evelyn stepped outside into the cold dusk, her heart shaking, and stared at the crumbling hotel next door, a forgotten building she had never once considered. But tonight, it called to her. She walked toward it with a trembling breath, unaware that this single step would rewrite everything her son thought he controlled. Evelyn returned to the inn late that night, her steps softer than her thoughts. She kept replaying Mark's words, unsure whether the sting came from the cruelty or the cold confidence behind it. She had given him everything she could, taught him every lesson she knew. Yet somehow he saw her as someone he needed to remove. But now, holding the key from the old hotel in her pocket, she felt an unfamiliar strength bloom inside her. She didn't know what she would do with the building yet, or how Mark would react. But for the first time in years, she sensed a door opening rather than closing. And that alone kept her from breaking. The next morning, Evelyn entered the kitchen hoping for a moment of peace. But Mark was already there, pacing with his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't see her at first, and his voice cut sharp through the quiet room as he spoke to someone about expanding the property and removing old liabilities. The words felt like stones thrown against her chest. When he finally noticed her, he forced a smile too quick to be real, asking if she had slept well, as if his cruelty the night before had been nothing more than a passing breeze. Evelyn nodded quietly, choosing silence over confrontation, but something inside her shifted. She wondered if Mark even realized what he was becoming, or if Lydia had convinced him that ambition was worth more than blood. Later that afternoon, Evelyn stepped outside for fresh air, only to see Lydia standing by the driveway, arguing with a contract. Lydia's voice carried across the gravel, sharp and impatient, demanding faster work on the inn's renovations. When she spotted Evelyn, she gave a tight smile, one that held no warmth, before turning back to her clipboard. Evelyn paused at the sight, realizing how quickly Lydia had taken over decisions that once belonged to her and her husband. She felt a twist of loss, but also a growing sense that Lydia's rush wasn't about improvement. It was about erasing the past. Evelyn wondered how long they'd been planning to push her out, and why neither of them had the courage to say it to her face before last night. That evening, when the inn grew quiet and the last guest walked upstairs, Evelyn slipped into the small office her husband once used. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedar, untouched since the funeral. She sat at the desk and opened the drawer where he kept important documents, searching without fully knowing what she hoped to find. But instead of answers, she found a blank ledger and a pen that had long run dry. A wave of loneliness washed over her, not just for him, but for the family she thought she still had. Yet even in the silence, she felt the key in her pocket pressing gently against her side, reminding her she wasn't powerless. Something inside her whispered that this was only the beginning. Mark barely slept after watching his mother walk into the abandoned hotel. By morning, panic pushed him into action. He stood over the dining room table, spreading blueprints across the surface, tracing the expansion lines that now directly collided with the hotel property. Everything he had planned, every loan, every promise he made to Lydia's family, depended on controlling both lots. And now his mother owned half the land he needed. He kept telling himself she bought it out of confusion, maybe grief, maybe nostalgia. But deep down he felt something heavier. She had made a move he didn't expect. And he hated being outplayed. Lydia, sipping her tea, watched him unravel, a small smirk tugging at her lips, knowing Evelyn had disrupted far more than business plans. By midday, Lydia convinced Mark to confront Evelyn directly. Though she made sure to stay behind, she wanted Mark to do the dirty work himself. Evelyn stood outside the old hotel, sweeping debris from the doorway when Mark marched across the property line. His voice came out tight, forced, as he asked why she bought the building. Evelyn answered calmly, saying she simply wanted a place that felt like her own. Mark's jaw tightened at her tone. He tried to hint at zoning issues, costs, safety hazards, anything to scare her out. But Evelyn didn't flinch. Something in her steadiness made him feel strangely small, like she saw right through the man he was pretending to be. And that frightened him more than he would ever admit. Later that afternoon, Evelyn heard footsteps echo inside the hotel and turned to find Ruth Marlowe, walking in with her usual brisk confidence. Her oldest friend looked around the ruined lobby, taking in every detail with the sharp eyes of someone who understood more than she let on. Evelyn explained everything. Mark's words, the purchase, the growing tension. And Ruth listened quietly before opening her briefcase. She pulled out a set of old legal documents Evelyn hadn't seen since her husband's passing. Ruth's voice dropped low as she revealed that the inn's land agreement wasn't as simple as Mark believed. For the first time in days, Evelyn felt the ground shift in her favor. When Mark returned to the inn that evening, he expected Lydia to comfort him, or at least support his frustration. Instead, she confronted him with sharp irritation. She wanted results, not excuses. Every delay threatened the impression she promised her family, an upscale expansion, a symbol of their combined ambitions. She reminded Mark that appearances mattered, and right now, he looked weak. Mark tried to defend himself, saying Evelyn would eventually give in, but Lydia's icy stare made him feel like a child scrambling for approval. In that moment, he realized Lydia wasn't afraid of Evelyn owning the hotel. She was afraid of Mark failing to control the situation. As night settled over the lakeside town, Evelyn sat by the window inside the hotel, the moonlight cutting through the gloom. She spread out Ruth's documents on the dusty counter, reading every line carefully. The more she read, the more she realized her husband had protected her in ways she never understood, leaving safeguards Mark had overlooked, rights that could shift the balance entirely. For the first time since the betrayal, Evelyn felt steady, even hopeful. She didn't want a fight, but if her son insisted on pushing her out, she now had the means to stand her ground. Quietly, she whispered a thank you to her late husband, feeling his love settle around her like a warm blanket in the cold room. Evelyn spent the next morning at the hotel, reading through every page Ruth had given her. As she traced her fingers over old signatures, she remembered quiet conversations with her husband. Moments she once thought were just tender ramblings that now felt like warnings she never understood. He had talked about protecting the inn from future mistakes, telling her that love didn't always keep a family together, but planning could. Evelyn wondered if he somehow sensed the path Mark would choose. The truth pressed on her chest like a weight. Her husband had left more control in her hands than Mark ever imagined. The thought frightened her as much as it comforted her. She didn't want power. She just wanted her family back. Across the property, Mark was pacing again. The contractor had called him early with bad news. Without access to the hotel land, the expansion would violate several zoning rules. Mark's temper rose, but underneath the anger was something more raw. Fear. Everything he promised Lydia's family depended on this project. She had convinced him this expansion was their opportunity to prove themselves, to rise above the small-town life he came from. But now, Evelyn was a wall he couldn't push through. The more he tried to force control, the more she held firm with quiet strength. It infuriated him because he didn't understand it. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't acting out of spite. She was acting out of hurt. Evelyn and Ruth met again that afternoon, spreading documents across the hotel counter. Ruth explained that before his death, Evelyn's husband had quietly changed the ownership structure. Jamie, Evelyn's younger son, had been left controlling shares of the inn, shares Mark didn't know existed. Evelyn felt her breath catch. She had believed both sons were treated equally, But this changed everything. Ruth admitted she kept the secret because Evelyn's husband asked her to wait until the right time. Evelyn wondered if she had failed her family by not seeing the storms building around her sooner. Still, the truth offered something she desperately needed. Another way forward. One Mark didn't control. Meanwhile, Lydia grew more frustrated with every passing hour. She stood on the inn balcony overlooking the lake, scrolling through messages from her mother. Each one a reminder of the expectations placed on her. She had promised them results, promised a future built on status, not sentiment. Lydia convinced herself she was helping Mark grow up, that she was pushing him to be stronger, smarter, more ambitious. But when she looked across the water and saw Evelyn moving confidently around the hotel property, something inside her twisted. Evelyn wasn't breaking. She was rising. And Lydia feared what Mark would become if he realized his mother had more power than either of them had assumed. Evelyn spent the evening cleaning the hotel entrance, wanting to reclaim at least one corner of the space. As she swept leaves from the porch, she paused when she noticed a small family of ducks waddling toward the water, their quiet unity stirring something deep inside her. She longed for that same closeness with her sons, yet now a secret hung between them. One that could break the fragile pieces still holding them together. She knew Jamie would return someday, but she didn't know how Mark would react when he learned his younger brother held the power he believed belonged to him. Evelyn whispered a silent hope that the truth wouldn't shatter them beyond repair, but she feared the storm was already coming. The morning Jamie arrived, Evelyn didn't even hear the taxi pull up. She was inside the hotel, wiping dust from an old mirror, when she heard a familiar voice say her name, soft, unsure, but filled with warmth she hadn't felt in years. She turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway with his suitcase still in hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn's heart swelled with relief, guilt, and joy all at once. Jamie had always been the gentle one, the quiet soul who cared more about people than ambition. She hugged him tightly, feeling the weight of the past few days melt into his arms. But even as she held him, a question lingered in her mind. How much did he know about what was happening here? And how much was she ready to tell him? Jamie spent the afternoon walking through the hotel with Evelyn, listening carefully as she explained everything. Mark's harsh words, the purchase, the documents Ruth brought. He didn't interrupt, but his eyes darkened with every detail. When she finished, Jamie let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when he was trying to stay calm. He said he never wanted their family to fall apart, but he wasn't surprised that Mark's hunger for approval had twisted into something colder. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, worried she was planting hatred between her sons, but Jamie shook his head. He wasn't angry at Evelyn. He was angry that she had been alone through all of it. Back at the inn, Mark was stunned when he saw Jamie standing in the lobby. The smile he forced was thin, strained, barely stretching past his confusion. Jamie hugged him, but the embrace lacked the warmth of old times. Lydia stood behind Mark, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. Jamie had always been harder for her to read, quiet, observant, unwilling to be manipulated. Mark tried to pretend nothing was wrong, offering Jamie a drink and asking about his life abroad, but the conversation felt hollow. For the first time, Mark felt the ground beneath him shift. Jamie's presence alone softened the room, and Mark sensed, deep down, that his younger brother had returned with more than luggage. Later, while Mark stepped out to take a call, Jamie wandered into the office Evelyn once cherished. He noticed a drawer slightly ajar and pulled it open. Inside lay old ledgers, journals, and a small envelope labeled with his name, a note from his father he had never received. Jamie sat down and opened it carefully, reading the simple message inside, a reminder that family wasn't measured by success but by how they protected one another. His father wrote that if the family ever drifted apart, Jamie would be the one to bring them back. The words hit him harder than he expected. He closed the envelope slowly, realizing Mark had hidden this letter long ago. That truth changed everything. As evening settled, Jamie met Evelyn outside the hotel, the lake reflecting soft streaks of gold behind them. He handed her the letter, and she read it slowly, tears filling her eyes. She whispered that Mark must have found it after the funeral but never gave it to him. Jamie nodded, anger simmering beneath his gentle demeanor. He wasn't here to start a war, but the truth had changed his purpose. He told Evelyn he wasn't leaving. Not until she was protected and Mark faced the damage he had caused. Evelyn felt her heart tremble with pride and heartbreak. She had prayed for strength, and now her younger son stood ready to help her carry the weight she couldn't bear alone. The next morning, Mark stormed across the property to the hotel, fueled by fear more than anger. He found Evelyn and Jamie walking the perimeter, discussing repairs, and the sight of them together sent a sharp twist through his chest. He demanded to know why Jamie was interfering, claiming this was a family matter he could handle. But Jamie didn't raise his voice. He simply told Mark the truth, that he knew about the hidden letter and the shares their father had left him. Mark's face drained of color. Evelyn watched her sons stand inches apart, one shaking with panic, the other steady with quiet resolve. For a moment she feared they might never find their way back to each other. Mark turned away abruptly, unable to look at either of them. It was the first time Evelyn saw her son truly afraid of losing everything. The tension only worsened when Lydia confronted Evelyn later that day. She cornered her outside the inn, voice sharp enough to cut the quiet afternoon air. Lydia accused Evelyn of manipulating Jamie, of sabotaging their future, of being too emotional to make decisions. The words stung, not because of their cruelty, but because they revealed how little Lydia understood her. Evelyn tried to walk away, but Lydia stepped closer, her tone turning vicious as she blamed Evelyn for Mark's stress. Guests passing by slowed, shocked by Lydia's hostility. Evelyn kept her composure, but inside she felt something break. Not her heart, but her patience. She finally realized Lydia didn't just dislike her. She wanted to erase her completely. Later that evening, Jamie found Evelyn sitting alone inside the half-cleaned hotel, staring at the old front desk. She admitted how much it hurt to be treated as an inconvenience, even after a lifetime of giving her family everything she had. Jamie sat beside her, reminding her that the hotel wasn't just a building. It was proof she still had choices, proof she wasn't at Mark and Lydia's mercy. Their conversation softened the ache in Evelyn's chest. For the first time in days, she laughed softly at one of Jamie's small jokes. In that quiet corner of the worn-down lobby, mother and son found comfort in each other, stitching together a small piece of what their family had lost. Meanwhile, Ruth was digging deeper into the documents. That night, she arrived at the hotel with a file in hand and a look that made Evelyn's heart tighten. She placed the final estate papers on the counter and explained that Evelyn's husband had not only given Jamie controlling shares, he had also given Evelyn the right to block any major structural changes to the inn. Mark's entire expansion depended on her approval. Evelyn ran her fingers over the words, stunned by the protection her husband had hidden within the legal language. For the first time, she realized she wasn't fighting a losing battle. She was standing on ground her husband had secured long before any of this began. That night, Evelyn sat at the window of the hotel, watching tiny lights flicker across the lake. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the secrets, the fear, pressed against her. But she felt something stronger rising beneath it. For the first time, she wasn't reacting to Mark and Lydia. She was preparing. Tomorrow, the town would gather for a community meeting about the expansion, and Evelyn knew this was her moment to speak. She didn't want revenge. She wanted truth. She wanted the town to know what her husband built, what her family nearly lost, and who had tried to tear it apart. As the moon glowed across the water, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. She would not be silenced again. The town hall buzzed with voices even before the meeting began. Evelyn sat quietly in the second row, her hands resting on the documents Ruth helped her prepare. Mark and Lydia entered moments later, heads held high, pretending nothing was unraveling behind closed doors. But the tension in the room shifted when Jamie took a seat beside Evelyn, calmly placing a folder on his lap. When the mayor opened the floor, Mark launched into a presentation about the future of the lakefront, speaking with polished confidence, until Evelyn stood up. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew steadier with every word as she explained the truth behind the ownership, the restrictions her husband left in place, and the shares Mark tried to hide. Gasps rippled through the audience. Mark froze, the color draining from his face. Lydia stiffened, realizing their perfect plan had just shattered in public. Mark tried to defend himself, stumbling through half-formed explanations, but the room had already turned. People whispered, shaking their heads, questioning how he could hide something so important from his own family. Lydia urged him to stay composed, but her eyes flickered with fear as she realized her control over the narrative was slipping. Jamie stepped forward then, revealing the letter Mark had hidden after their father's death. The room fell silent. Evelyn watched Mark's throat tighten, his fingers curling at his sides. It wasn't anger she saw. It was shame. He looked like a man realizing he had pushed the wrong direction for far too long. And now the ground he stood on was crumbling. When the mayor asked Evelyn if she wished to make a final statement, she stepped forward with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She spoke not with anger, but with sorrow. About her husband's wishes, about preserving the heart of the inn, and about the importance of family over power. Her words softened some faces in the crowd, but they seemed to strike Mark the hardest. Evelyn saw him sink slightly where he stood, as if her disappointment carried more weight than any legal document. She didn't attack him. She simply told the truth, and somehow that truth felt heavier than anything else said that night. Lydia's jaw tightened, sensing the tide turning against them both. After the meeting, the crowd spilled into the parking lot, murmuring about the scandal. Lydia walked ahead, refusing to look at Mark, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. When they reached the edge of the lot, she turned to him with blazing eyes, accusing him of embarrassing her, ruining everything she worked for, and proving he wasn't the man she thought he was. Mark tried to explain, but she didn't listen. With cold finality, Lydia said she wouldn't be dragged down by his failures. Then she walked away, leaving him standing alone under the dim streetlights. For the first time in his life, Mark realized he had betrayed the only person who had ever loved him without condition, and lost the one who cared only for appearances. Evelyn and Jamie watched from across the parking lot as Mark stood frozen in place. For a moment, Evelyn considered walking over, but Jamie gently placed a hand on her arm. They both knew Mark needed space to confront the truth without anyone softening the blow. Evelyn's heart ached, yet she felt a quiet sense of closure. Her truth was finally spoken, and the town understood her. Now, the only thing left was for Mark to face himself and decide what kind of man he wanted to be. As she and Jamie walked back toward the hotel, Evelyn felt her husband's presence in the gentle wind brushing past her, as if reminding her she had done exactly what she needed to do. The next morning, Mark showed up at the hotel before sunrise, his shoulders slumped, his eyes tired from a night without sleep. Evelyn found him standing by the broken front steps, staring at the peeling paint as if the old building suddenly carried every mistake he'd made. When she approached, he didn't look up right away. Instead, he whispered that he never meant to hurt her, that he'd been trying so hard to impress people who didn't care, and somewhere along the way, he stopped caring about the ones who actually mattered. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She didn't forgive him instantly, but she saw the boy he used to be hiding behind the man he'd become. It was the first time in years he spoke without pride, only regret. Inside the hotel, Jamie joined them, his face softened but still cautious. Mark tried to apologize to him as well, stumbling over his words as he admitted to hiding the letter and pushing him away for years. Jamie listened quietly, arms crossed, then finally told Mark that forgiveness wasn't something he could demand. It was something he had to earn. The brothers stood in silence, the old walls around them, echoing memories of a childhood that once held warmth. Evelyn watched them both, wishing she could bridge every gap between them, but knowing they had to take those steps on their own. Still, she felt a small spark of hope. For the first time, they were speaking honestly. Later that day, Evelyn walked Mark through the hotel's empty rooms, letting him see what she saw. A place full of stories, memories, and potential. She explained that she wasn't trying to ruin his dreams. She simply refused to let their family's legacy be erased for the sake of image. Mark listened with tears gathering in his eyes as she spoke of the promises she made to his father, of the nights she stayed awake, worrying about losing both her sons. He whispered that he never realized how deeply his choices cut her. The truth settled between them like a fragile truce, delicate but real. Evelyn didn't take his hand, but she didn't pull away when he reached for hers. By sunset, the three of them gathered on the lake shore. Jamie skipped a stone across the water, breaking the stillness with soft ripples. Mark stood beside him, watching the circles widen, and finally murmured that he wanted to help rebuild both the hotel and the trust he had shattered. Jamie didn't smile, but he nodded, offering the smallest sign of acceptance. Evelyn breathed in the cool air, letting the peace settle around her. For the first time since the betrayal, she felt like the pieces of her family might slowly fit together again. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not quickly, but enough to start healing. Orange. Yee. That night, Evelyn unlocked the door to the inn and paused when she heard footsteps behind her. Mark stood there, hands in his pockets, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked, "Mom, do you have room for me?" The question struck her harder than his rejection ever had. She turned slowly, seeing the man he was, the flaws, the remorse, the longing to be better. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened the door wider, letting warm lamplight spill into the night. Mark stepped inside with quiet gratitude, and Evelyn felt tears gather in her eyes. She wasn't giving him a clean slate, but she was giving him a place to start again. And for their family, that was enough.